Hello, this is Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project. I'm here to have a conversation with Thomas Neto. This is part 3 of our conversation. We had 2 previous conversations. I'll put links in the description of this video that are available on this channel. The subject that we've been talking about has been the concept of self-ownership. In our previous conversations, we kind of delved into what self-ownership really is, which is basically the idea that everyone has right over only their own selves, and responsibility that comes with that as well. And in our previous conversations, we've spoken about various implications to this, as well as the kind of philosophical conversation about morality itself, and why the concept of self-ownership is justified as a moral concept and a moral principle. And so we're just following on that conversation, and we've got a few interesting subjects to delve into. So I'm just going to hand it over to Thomas now and say thank you once again for taking the time to have this conversation. Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt. Thanks for letting me be here for a third time to have a chat on these topics. I think we both had a lot of fun last 2 previous times. We talked about a whole range of subjects, from self-ownership to how it interacts with how it works for children, for animals, for slavery, all sorts of things. I think we got quite in depth with some of those topics. Of course, with these sort of conversations, they could always go deeper. They could last for hours and hours, as they kind of did the last 2 times. But it was a lot of fun. It was very interesting to have my mind had thought about these ideas in a different way, from a different perspective. For example, I remember last time we were discussing slavery, and we were finding a way to create a definition for a slave that we could both agree with. And you came up with a person who is treated as property. And from both of our perspectives, it creates a perfect solution, because it has the moral claim that this is not correct. People should not be treated as property, as you and I both agreed eventually after a little while of having differences with our language. But it was a lot of fun. I think this time, since we touched a little bit on the whether a person should own a product of their labor. I mentioned this in the first video, where I said that a person should own the product of their labor. They mix their labor with the land or with a material resource, and they should own it. But reflecting upon it a little bit further, I couldn't think of a lot of ways to defend this position necessarily. So if you're happy to go over that, I assume that that's something you believe in, with your position of self-ownership. So we can go ahead and start from there and talk about this idea that someone should own the product of their labor.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, basically, it starts off like everything that I'm sort of advocating here. It starts off with the concept of self-ownership. So, if we are in acceptance that people have right over themselves, how I term it, ownership over themselves, then what I'm basically saying is that property rights exists as an extension of your self-ownership. So, because you own yourself, then you own your actions, both in the sense of having right over them and in the sense of being responsible for them. So if you were to create property with those actions, the only person that has a rightful claim of ownership over that property is yourself. Now, this is obviously with other factors being neutral. I mean, obviously, if you stole the resources you used to create the property, or if if you're violating self-ownership in any way in the process, then that would invalidate your claim. But assuming there's nothing like that going on, assuming that it's just a case of you using your actions to create property, then like I say, the product of your labor. I mean, I suppose it's a bit of a cop-out way of coming at it from the other angle, but in the other sense, it's like I can't see any argument against that, because it's like, well, who else could own it? You know, if I build a house, who else could possibly own that house other than me? You know, so it's kind of like, so there's one aspect of it, is they're like, well, if anyone owns it, surely it can only be me. But the other aspect of it is I feel like it's just a natural progression of self-ownership. If I own myself in the sense that I'm like, because the thing about self-ownership, I own my body, I own my thoughts and actions. And like I say, that means both in a responsibility sense and in a right sense. So, you know, if I commit a crime, then it's me that committed that crime, and I have to face the consequences because they were my actions. So I own them in that sense. But then I use the same logic. If I built a house, again, that's the product of my actions. I built that house, so it's my house. So that's kind of my defense of the position.
Sure. So it's more of a linguistic idea. We did go over briefly the linguistics argument, whether it's, you know, it's, well, we went over this, but yeah, it's we went over you know, my sister as opposed to my phone, and we discovered that even though mine or yours can be used to describe a relationship of property, a relationship of ownership, it could just mean in relation to. With the going with your example of the house, we can start with that. So uh, if you build a house, you mentioned if you don't own it, who else does, or who else should? You mentioned it's hard to see arguments from the other side, how to argue against that. Hopefully, this is why I'm here to do that. And when we have a house, in this example, you have built the house, and so you have the property rights for it. Of course, you can buy a house without having it being built. If you say this is my house, you can have a moral claim over that house, regardless of whether you build it or not. So um, it means that ownership and valid ownership of the house is not necessarily reliant on your labor. So we have to find a way where the labor itself creates the ability to get this moral claim. Yeah, you're gonna say something?
Yeah, well, I mean, I still don't think you lose that, because, like, say for example, like, obviously I used a very simplistic example. Very few people build their houses, you know, in the real world. But so I was just simplifying the example. So, like, you know, obviously, if you build your house, then that's your house, and you say, okay, yeah, if I build my house, then it's my house. If we accept that, then if it's my house, I can sell it to somebody else. So they own the house, you know. So, like, the fact that I own the product of my labor doesn't mean that I can't sell that property that I created, and equally means that I can sell my labor itself. So just like under normal circumstances, if I build some property, you know, just from my own volition, then I own the product of that labor. But I might not necessarily want to own the product of my labor, in the sense that I may have an arrangement with somebody, again, as long as it's a voluntary arrangement, where I say to someone, look, I'll sell you my labor, I'll rent my labor out to you for however long, and for, you know, under whatever conditions, again, as long as it's a voluntary agreement, and then that person can own the product of your labor. But it's still you owning the product of your labor for you to be able to sell it, if you know what I mean. So even in the scenario that you gave, it doesn't invalidate the claim I'm making that you own the product of your labor, because yes, other people built the house, but they sold their labor. Other people might have owned the house, but they sold the house. All of that still requires ownership as a startup. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, of course. And you do you gave an interesting example where you can indeed, in a voluntary relationship, for example, with an employer, you can use your labor to build the house. You can be hired to build the house for someone else, and of course that means that that the action of mixing your labor uh, does not prove that you ought to own it, right? Because there's a possibility where it's still voluntary, but you are using your labor to build this house, and then you don't have the claim, the moral claim of property to the house. The employer does.
Yes, but that is only because you have forfeited that through your own agreement. You know, like I say, if you were building a house under normal circumstances, you would own that house. But because you've made an agreement where, okay, I'm going to, it's like I'm renting myself out to you for the day, in that sense. And obviously, and I'm basically saying to you, look, under normal circumstances, because I own my labor, the product of my labor is mine, but I'm going to rent my labor out to you so that the product of my labor is yours. But it's still mine as a starting point for me to be able to sell it to you. In that sense, it's a little bit like if I owned a car, I could rent it out to you and you can drive it, and perhaps you could drive it in a way that would be part of your job, like if you're a taxi driver or something like that, and you can make money from it. I don't have a claim to that money because I lent you my car. Does that kind of make sense? So it's like, so from my point of view, it's not so much about saying whoever made that property owns it as some kind of absolute never-ending state, because whoever owns it can obviously sell it. And like I say, they can sell their labor so that they don't even own the product of it from the creation of it, because they've made this arrangement. But it still starts off with the fact that they own themselves or have right over themselves. And because you're starting from that starting point, that's what makes you own property. Again, it's your ownership over yourself that allows you to own what you create. But that same ownership over yourself also allows you to not own what you create if you choose to rent your labor out, or do it that way. Does that make sense?
Sure. So, okay, I think we're getting somewhere slowly. We have the ability to be able to claim ownership of something that we create, and we can also relinquish this claim. But either way, it originates from the self-ownership, right? And if we have the ability to make a moral claim because of our labor, and we have the ability to not make a moral claim because of our labor, then perhaps the labor itself isn't part of the equation, if that makes sense. Because if uh, if your labor is A and you get to the conclusion B, uh, no, let me phrase that differently. The outcome of ownership is different. However, in both circumstances, you use your labor. So it's not the labor itself that changes. It's something within you, within your rights, your capabilities to distinguish the two, to say either I have built this house and now I own it, and I have built this house for my employer voluntarily, therefore they own it.
Um, yeah, I mean, I suppose it's more about, I mean, labor only becomes part of the equation if it's part of the equation, but it's more about the extension of your ownership or the extension of your rights. So to give you an example, oh, I'm sorry, bear with me 1 second.
No, it's
Sorry. Sorry about that. um, sorry, I'm going to turn that off. I thought I turned it off. And I've lost my train of thought. Oh, yes, no. Right, okay. So imagine you had an ice cream machine, and it's your ice cream machine. Like, you own it rightfully, right? It's your property. So when you make ice creams from that ice cream machine, you obviously own those ice creams, and you could sell them and what have you. Now, let's say someone says to you, okay, can I rent your ice cream machine for a day? And you say, okay, yes, because it's your ice cream machine, you can rent the ice cream machine out to that other person. And whilst they've rented it out, they're going to own the ice creams that ice cream machine's making while they're renting it out. So I don't know if that works perfectly to kind of demonstrate my point, but it's kind of the same sort of thing. If you imagine yourself as your own ice cream machine, and you owning the product of your labor just like you would own the ice creams that you produce, it's like someone else saying, okay, well, again, as you're the owner, you have the right to rent it out to other people if you want to, and someone else rents it off you, so they're going to own the ice creams, but it's still your ice cream machine to rent out to others to do that, just like your body is yours to rent out to others in the same sense as like the labor. So because the labor is yours, you can rent it out to others. Because the labor is yours, you can own what you create, or you can rent your labor out to others so they own what you create. Or you could own what you create and sell it. You know, I mean, there's all sorts of things you can do, but it all starts. So it's more about your rights over something and then the implications of that. So I'm basically saying the implications of you owning yourself, then that extends to an ownership over your, you know, over your actions, which obviously includes your labor. And as I say, that works both ways. It means that you're guilty for the crimes you commit, but it also means you have that ownership claim over the property you create. And so it's like, you know, you're responsible in the good and the bad way, if that makes sense.
Then I might get you to, I think, well, you did mention that it's more to do with your rights, and I think that's the position that I'm leaning more towards. You gave the example of the ice cream machine, and that got me thinking, what if you purchased the machine? You did not build this machine at all. You simply had money to buy this machine. It builds shoes or whatever, trinkets. And the machine works completely automatically. By the single fact that you own the machine, you get to own what the machine produces. So you get the products that come out of the machine. And this is without any labor from your part at all. So in this example, we can see quite clearly that your labor isn't required at all to create new ownership claims. It's about entirely your rights or your ability to make moral claims. What we can completely detach your labor, and you can still create new moral claims to ownership.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I suppose the other way I would kind of say the same thing is that it's not your labor that makes ownership. I mean, that's one way you could create, you know, you can own property through your labor. That's one way, but you could also acquire it through voluntary trade from the person who did create it and get their ownership that way. So, so yeah, that is true. But as I say, I still don't think that changes the fact that it still starts from your self-ownership, and somebody's ownership over their labor was relevant. Like at some point, labor was involved to build that, and whether the person who used their labor to create it was the owner who sold it, or whether that person who owned the labor that created it sold their labor to the person who owned it. Either way, labor was still involved. An ownership of labor was still involved in the equation earlier on the line. But yes, it's not the only way that someone can acquire property ownership by labor themselves. Somebody else could have used their labor and then just sold it to you. Now you could still say, well, there's still my labor attached to it because the money I used to buy it was the product of my labor in some other venture, you know, so you could still make that claim. But even without that, like I say, you still got that situation where you can say, well, okay, there's lots of ways I can acquire ownership. It's not just through creating it. I can voluntary trade and get it, or someone could give it to me or whatever. Again, as long as it's still in line with that principle. But the ownership over someone's labor is never, it might not always be in the equation, but it's never contradicted, if that makes sense. It's always valid. Even if I'm an employee, like, you know, like when I go to work, I don't own the product of my labor because I've made an agreement with my employer that I go to work for 12 hours and the product of my labor he owns, and I get compensated, and you know, and that's part of that arrangement. But it's only because I own my labor that I can make that decision. So
Yeah, I think it's possible. I completely agree, first of all, that there's more than one way to make claims of ownership to something. Specifically, when discussing labor, it's difficult to kind of make the leap between self-ownership and the object or what product that you create. For me, yeah, you use this word extension. It's an extension of yourself. So I think if we want to try and really uh, get into this curious idea of why is it that when you mix certain sand and dirt and cement to create concrete, why is that suddenly belong to you? Why does that physical action create this concept concept of having a relationship with a product that pertains uh, almost in an authoritative way to you. You have complete control over this physical object now, and other people respect it, and so on. And once we get there, maybe getting into the limitations of this idea, right? If I make a sand castle in the beach, do I own the beach? How do we agree with what is sufficient labor, with what is homesteading, and so on and so forth. So, first of all, going back to the previous idea, how do you get from applying physically, applying your effort into creating something, into producing something, and then from there having a conceptual agreement around this object?
Okay, well, I mean, part of it comes back to how we define our reality. So it's like, say you've got a bunch of materials, and there might be like natural materials that you've just taken from, from our shared environment. So anyone had access to it at that time. These materials aren't something that you owned exclusively, but you weren't stealing them, so you have right to use them or what have you. Now, in that state, in its natural state, you don't have any ownership claim because that's not your property. You didn't create that. But once you say you turn that material into something else, and this is where it is partly depending on us having an agreement on reality that you have created something else now. What you have created, well, like I say, is something that you've created. Like I say, now it is your property. Now it is the product of your labor. So like I say, this is why I say about it comes from self-ownership in the sense of, I mean, perhaps extension is not the right word because that feels like you're stretching it beyond where it already is, if you know what I mean. I would more describe it as implication. So like, if you own yourself in that sense of having full ownership and right and responsibility over everything that we incorporate as being yourself, so that's your thoughts and actions and everything that is your labor. So from there, the implication is that you do own your labor. If you own yourself, it's kind of like it's part of the package, if you like. So if you own your labor, then you do also own the product of your labor, in the sense of, like I say, if I throw a stone at somebody and it hits them on the head, I own that action in the sense that I'm guilty of assault. You know what I mean? So I own that. I own what happened there. I own the consequences of my action. So like, it's right and responsibility thing. That's why I always say that rights and responsibility are kind of connected and go hand in hand in that sense. And like I say, and then if I build something and I've created it, it's no longer in its natural state. It's no longer the part of our shared environment that everybody has rights to. It's now something new. It's now something that I've created with my own labor. It hasn't grown literally off my body in the sense of like my hair is mine because but I've cultivated it in that same sense. It wasn't that before, and now it is that because of what I've done. So it's kind of there. And just to jump forward to the sandcastle thing, so I wanted to answer that question as soon as you gave it. You own the sandcastle. You don't own the beach because you didn't create the beach, but you did create the sandcastle. Now, obviously, most people don't get too territorial over their sandcastles. At the end of the day, they'll let the tide take it. But if you wanted to, you could slice that underneath, put a little base in it, put a little glass case around it, take it home, and that's your sandcastle. And if someone, and I know it sounds like a very low level crime, but technically if someone came along and stepped on your sandcastle, that would be a violation of the non-aggression principle. Pretty low level stuff, but but technically but to be honest, the sandcastle thing almost sums it up perfectly, because you could argue from a like a physics point of view, well, that's still just sand. Why is it different from the beach? Because you've made it into something new. So it does depend on us agreeing reality that I've created a sandcastle. But the fact of the matter is I don't own the beach because I didn't create the beach. I've just taken something from the beach that I've been able to do in a sustainable way as well. So I've not destroyed the beach with the creation of my sandcastle. You know what I mean? So yeah, so that would be perfect. That's a perfect example, I think, to describe what I'm talking about.
Sure. I think you make a lot of good points when talking about the manner in which your labor interacts with the natural resources is to create something new. I think that does make sense, and you know, I'm listening to your arguments, and it's things that I'm fairly aware of. They're pretty widely accepted ideas, but I think there's a few things here and there that make me wonder about their validity. With the sandcastle, of course, yes, you did not mix yourself. You did not change the entire beach into something new. Same thing if you change the salt content of the ocean by pouring a little beaker of salt into the water. No, of course not. Um, but I think my position is that it leans more and more towards consensus than it does to actual physical change. Because there's going to be a point where you build a sandcastle in the sand. You have created something new, and there's going to be limitations to what new means, right? Because you can make your sandcastle more and more simplistic. So it's to the point where you create just a mound in the beach and you say, I have created something new. This part of the beach is now mine. And some people will say, no, you have moved sand. Moving something isn't sufficient and does not constitute building something. A mound of sand does not a sandcastle make. And I'm thinking that when these examples that we think of, and I'm sure we can come up with many, and of course, I'm giving extreme examples exactly to test the fiber of this idea, right? Because I'm always thinking, okay, yes, of course, that makes sense, that you're just applying your labor to one tiny portion of the beach. So how much of that can I stretch where it still makes sense? So eventually, there's gonna be a limit. Uh, I imagine where you make a sandcastle so simplistic, or creating something new is so similar to how it originally was, that the claim of ownership is no longer valid. And I think where that area is will vary from person to person, right? If you carve a tree just slightly, to you it could be a sculpture. To someone else, they've just chipped away at 5 centimeters of a tree. This isn't labor. You can't own this. You can't own the whole tree, let alone this tiny fraction of it. And it'll depend on person to person what creating something new is, whether something is uh, well, it's not valuable, but it's considered to be uh, producing something, a product. So because of that, I feel like again, it just leans more towards consensus. It's more to do with your property rights are more what other people accept than what you actually input into creating a product.
I would I would disagree with that somewhat, because I would say, I mean, I do agree that consensus isn't completely out of the picture, but I think it's only really in a minimal sense of just interpreting reality, like, because people can pick the holes out of anything if they want to go high resolution enough. Even the whole thing about self, like I said, we've got to start on a base reality. Even for self-ownership, we need although we can't go straight from an is to an ought, like I say, we have to have that if in between that I mentioned in our previous conversation. But even there, we still need to have the is. We still need to start from the reality that you are you and I am me, and that doesn't necessarily jump straight to you own you and I own me, but we still need that as a starting point. And it's a little bit similar with what you're talking about. We do need to have a certain consensus on how we interpret reality. And like I say, some people could say, well, you aren't you and I aren't we? All we are is just like, matter that's moving around, and there's not really anything different between me and this cup in any kind of meaningful sense. When you get down to the quantum level, certainly not, so there's always the potential for that, but I don't think that invalidates the principle, because even though there's a certain level of consensus, if you like, with regards to how we're interpreting reality, that's always going to be required, you're still working it from a principle. You're still saying, okay, because we interpret reality as this, and because we accept this principle to work on that template of reality, then we come up with this. So it's not as because otherwise it would be completely arbitrary if we were just basically saying, oh well, it's just what we're all agreeing to without anything underpinning that. It's like, well, no, we're agreeing to it based on, we understand this is reality. So so it's like with the sandcastle, the sand mound thing, it's like we're understanding the separation of what you created, regardless of what we think of it. I mean, too much like, to use the example that you meant, or what if you just made a mound? It's not much of a sandcastle. Okay, well, it's his mound. He still doesn't own the beach, though. It doesn't matter how good or bad his sandcastle is. He still only owns that, the product of his labor. If I carve something into a tree, then you could, like I said, if you want to be really objective about it, just keep it to that. So if I carve something into the tree, no, I don't own the tree, but I own the carving. You know what I mean? Like if I did like I say, to me, better example, let's say I painted a picture. I used a tree as like a canvas and I painted this beautiful picture on this tree. I still don't own the tree, but I own the picture. You know what I mean? I can't really do much with it because it's now attached to a tree that I don't own, but that was my fault for painting it there. But you know what I mean? It's like, so you can still, if like, in the interest of trying to be as objective as possible and keep subjectivity at a minimum, we can't completely kick it out the door, because how we view reality, you could argue, is subjective to some degree. So we can't completely, but we minimize subjectivity as best we can, and we be as objective as we can with the principles. And if we do that, then even real obscure examples like like the sandcastle or the carving into the tree, even that we can kind of create a relatively simplistic approach to assessing what you do and don't own. You own the product of your labor. So you drew a picture on that tree or carved your name. Okay, you own that little signature or you own that little picture, but you don't own the tree. You make a sandcastle on the beach. Okay, you own that sandcastle. And if you want to take it home, you can separate it from the beach and put it in a little case and preserve it, do whatever you want with it. But doesn't mean you own the beach, because the beach is still just the beach, so I hope that will make sense.
Yeah, sure. So you would agree that something just to I do understand that
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I'm hearing what you're saying, that there needs to be some sort of uh, framework or objectivity to what we're talking about, because if you make a carving in a tree, there's going to be certain molecules that you've affected and certain molecules that you haven't, and of course you have to have some sort of estimation that people agree with. Interestingly, that comes back to consensus as well, but uh, uh, just as a side note, I think that most people might think that a carving or making a mound wouldn't be enough, actually, to constitute producing something. It's interesting that you that you think it is, that where something so small can still be considered a product of your labor, and you still have rights to ownership over it. It's interesting. I would have to say uh, it's a little problematic for me, because then it's hard to distinguish what is a product of someone's labor and what isn't. If you make a carving in a tree, if it's just a circle or a line, it has no indication that it was even formed by a human, right? And we're starting from the idea that only humans can claim ownership, and only humans can produce things that they own from their actions. So
I wouldn't actually necessarily go along with that claim, though that opens up its own little conversation. But I understand where you're coming from with regards to, like, how minimal can someone be? But it's like, but even the examples you gave, I mean, it's like if I carve into a tree, no matter how minimal it is that carving is still mine in the sense that I carved into that tree, no matter what. So that reality is true. But in the same sense, if I do a carving into a tree that's basically, it's almost indistinguishable from something that's just like naturally occurred, or like an animal brushed past accidentally or whatever, then I've got no reasonable expectations for my property rights, if you like, to be respected, because there's no way I've not made it possible for anybody to even be able to recognize it as my property. So again, it's I understand where you're coming from, and where it would be problematic if we got really anal retentive about every little consequence of every person's actions being their property, and and all of that. To a certain extent, we just let things go. You know what I mean? And there's also the issue of abandonment. So even if you did have rightfully owned property, if you just abandoned ownership of it, then you kind of just leave it. Like if I build a sandcastle, but then I just go away and let the tide wash it or whatever, and someone comes across it the next day, I've not made any indication that I'm still making any claim of ownership over that. I've just abandoned it. It's pretty obvious that I've abandoned it. So, you know what I mean? So there's that as well. So I think there are things that can still address the potential problematic aspects of saying, you own your labor, therefore that's how you own property. I think you can still have that basis and just understand that, just as a basic matter of how we live our lives and how we interpret reality, there's always going to have to be a certain consensus. But what we want to do is we want to keep that consensus. We want to push subjectivity to the absolute minimum, so that and keep things as objective as possible. That's why I like to say, even though it seems silly to say, "Oh, you own your sandcastle," because it's such a little thing, or "I own the painting I drew on that tree." It seems like a small thing, but it's just really, but technically, if we want to be faithful to the principles, that is the implication. And when we can use that same principle and the same implications that come from it to more real world things that we do care about, like building houses and stuff like that. But to take it to these more extreme examples, we can still find the answer there, as a technicality, but it's often something that we're not going to enforce even ourselves, because we're like, okay, yeah, I carved that in a tree, but I don't even remember where that tree is anymore, and I've left it back to nature again or whatever. So does that make sense?
yeah, sure. You did go over precisely the point I was trying to make, and you explained it very well, which was exactly that. If you create a line across a tree, if you etch something into a tree, and it's so simplistic to the point where that it's indistinguishable from being produced by an animal or whatever, uh, then yeah, it's kind of pointless to go around and decide, was this created by a human or their labor? Is this a claim of ownership? Yeah, it's nonsensical. You've explained it very well, and I completely agree with you there. Um, I might say that um, I still don't fully understand the reason why ownership should be made with labor, um, or should derive from labor. Of course, with the example of a house, just going back to that real quick, it's made much more clear that someone has applied their labor to it. You can agree on a consensus, and my personal opinion, of course, is that it leans more and more to consensus. And again, I was hearing your point very clearly about you want to decrease subjectivity as much as possible, and so you want to create this framework upon which you can try to be as objective as possible. Of course, perfect objectivity is impossible, but what you can try and do is create a framework that has a certain set of rules that says, listen, first of all, you own yourself, you own the product of your labor, assuming it follows a certain set of rules, that it's distinguishable enough, there's no previous ownership, it's not been abandoned, and so on and so on and so on. And from there, you can decide as a society who owns what, who has the claims to what. And I think you made that quite clear. I'm still not quite there yet. I'm not. Just to be clear, I don't think I will be. I'm still a little unsure about these things left and right. What I might do though is for the pretty much entire duration of our conversation so far, you have been defending your points and I've been scrutinizing them. Perhaps I'll suggest a point of my own, and we'll compare it to this ownership claim
Okay.
from labor. And so, if you have an island and someone uses this framework of self-ownership, and from there, having the ability to own the product of your labor, and then claims exclusivity over a resource. I think it is not. It might not be the best route for the people on that island, assuming small island, small number of people. Of course, the example can be extrapolated for the world. But if you have one person claim ownership of a resource, then of course with property ownership, you have the ability to do whatever you want with, including destroy. And if one person has the legitimate ability to destroy a resource and have complete authority over it, it's negative for the outcome of not only the other people on the island, but in the end, society as a whole. So it includes that other person.
Are you talking about natural resources?
Yes.
Okay, well, I mean, but to clarify my own position, I mean, property ownership isn't the same as ownership of resources. So if I, like, for example, because the way I view it is, whether it's an island you're talking about or whether it's you're talking about the whole world, like say you can extrapolate it to big and small scales. The point is we have this shared environment with resources, natural resources that no one owns. So no one has an exclusive right to, and that doesn't change. But what does change is because we all have a right to use these resources, we can use these resources to create something new. So like in the example you gave, that was like, well, someone's just come along and claimed ownership over these resources. He can't do that because he doesn't have any claim over the resources. What he can do is use the resources in a sustainable manner to create something new that he does own. So, I mean, it's very similar. I do a similar thing with distinguishing property ownership from land ownership as I do property ownership from resource ownership. The only ownership I view as valid is property ownership, what you create as new. So the resources you use, you don't own them, but you have a right to use them. So you can obviously, you can then own them when they're part of something new, obviously, so it's like with the beach example, I don't own this sand, I don't own this beach, but the sand that I'm going to then take to build my sandcastle, now I own it but I don't own, it's not that I'm owning the sand, I'm owning the sand castle, and the sand has now become part of that. So it's a similar thing with the resources. So in the example you gave, that person wouldn't have a right to just claim ownership over the resources because he doesn't have any claim to that. But what he would have right to do is to use those resources to create property that he does have a right over. So I just wanted to clarify that little distinction, and sorry, just also to add a distinction as well on how this applies to land ownership, because I apply the exact same principle with land ownership. Technically, actual land ownership itself is not valid, but what is valid is property ownership. So if I'm standing somewhere, I don't have to, and it's, you know, it's just like the commons, like just not an area that's owned. I'm just standing somewhere. I own myself. I don't have to own the spot that I'm standing on for me to have rightful dominion over that spot while I stand there, because it's, you know, it's existing as an extension of me. When I move away from that spot, I have no claim over it anymore. But while I'm standing there, I do have a exclusive claim, not because I own the land, but just because I own me. And if someone pushed me off that spot, that would be an act of aggression. I use the exact same principle with the land underneath the house that I built. I don't own that land technically in a just land ownership on its own sense. I own my house, and I'm occupying and using that area of land to, you know, so while my house is there that I do rightfully own, I have that exclusive right over that area, not because I own that area, but just because what I do own is currently occupying and using that area. So it's kind of like using the occupancy and use that's probably something that is more often invoked by people of a more communist persuasion, but it's invoking that principle because it is valid on its own. I don't think it should ever override rightful property ownership, like, you know, I can occupy someone's house or something like that. But as a natural area, it's a little bit like, another example I like to give is like if I went for a picnic somewhere. So I just went for a picnic in some field. I don't own that field, but the area where I'm having the picnic, someone can't invade that while I'm having my picnic, because I do own me, I do own my picnic stuff, and we're currently occupying that area and using it. So that's the kind of the way I do it. When I talk about ownership of property, I am really only talking about actual property. I'm not talking about resources. I'm not talking about land. I'm not talking about our shared environment, because that is precisely that. It's our shared environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. That's said a lot of things there. A lot of interesting things as well. We might have to get into depth here, because in that last part of the conversation, you were talking about. I didn't know you had this perspective that you ultimately, by taking things um, to their logical extreme, that the land ownership is uh, potentially invalid, which is very interesting, and that use denotes ownership of a kind. That the house that you own is currently on the land, therefore you have a right to the land in a way,
Yeah,
but not
I call
necessarily.
it dominion. I say dominion. So I say your ownership over your house. That's your property. You own that regardless of whether you're there or not, because it's your property. But the land is not yours. You just have dominion over it while you're there. But the thing that separates it from ownership is your dominion is dependent on you occupying that area with you, either yourself or your rightfully owned property. Whereas your ownership over something doesn't have the same requirement. I don't have to be in my car for my property ownership to be valid. But if I'm not having a picnic in that field, then I have no claim over it. Someone else can have a picnic there. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, but someone else can't have a picnic in my house. You know what I mean? So it's
Yeah,
kind of
sure,
like,
sure.
yeah. So that's the distinction I make when I say that land ownership is invalid. Because some people, I have explained this to people before, and they said, well, what's the difference? Because it almost sounds like, well, it still sounds like land ownership because you have that exclusivity. And I'm like, yeah, it kind of works the same as land ownership in a way, because while you have your property rights, but it's not land ownership, it's property ownership, and you just happen to be occupying that land with your property. The reason why this is important is because this distinguishes valid dominion over land that is attached to property and in line with property rights from arbitrary claims of land ownership that we have today, where you have some people that own some big massive estate that's like forests and lakes, and you think, well, how the hell do they own that? They didn't make it. That's not their property, and you know, they would have acquired it through some kind of conquest if in the past or whatever. You know, there's no valid property right claim to those sort of ownership claims, and that's why I think it's important that when we deal with property rights, we are faithful to it from both angles. Because after a lot of people that invoke property rights, and this is one of the reasons why I don't identify as an ANCAP and I stick to the voluntarism thing, because a lot of ANCAPs fall into this trap of being like, oh yeah, property. They kind of forget where property rights comes from, in the sense of they think that things like land ownership are valid. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. Property rights comes from self-ownership, so it has to stick to that. It has to be grounded from that. You can't leap ahead to things that have no relation to where you've come from, you know. So, you know, I can own my house because I built that. That is something new. That is my property. But like I say, going to some island and just saying, oh, I own all these resources, it's like, well, no, you don't. They aren't your property, you know. So that's kind of how I conceptualize it.
Just going back to the island real quick, and then to this example, because it is quite interesting. I never meant that someone could just claim ownership of a resource, or just say this and all of the trees in this area belong to me. Not at all. Just going in line with the train of thought that you're presenting, where in some case, somehow, they could theoretically apply their labor to each and every tree, or even without taking complete dominion. Sorry, you had that word in my head now. The Without having complete control of the entirety of a resource, could just be part of it. I think the issue I have necessarily is the exclusivity and the authority over that property. So still with complete compliance with self-ownership and your right to the product of your labor. What irks me a little bit is the exclusivity. I don't think that's necessarily um, productive to a society, especially when you can destroy properties should you choose, because you have exclusive authority over it. You did mention, very briefly, you did mention that someone has a right to create something new, excuse me, as long as they do it in a sustainable way. Um, that's another extra rule we might get into a little bit. I would love that to be true. So I hope there could be a rule in there to sort that out.
Well, if I could just interject quickly, you did allude to it a little bit yourself when you made the point that someone can do what they want with their own property, up to and including destroying it, which is why it's so important to understand that people can only destroy that which they rightfully own. So when it comes to, like, you know, sustainable use and destroying property, you can't do something that is, you know, like I say, I can burn my house to the ground because it's my house. Well, I mean, burning it to the ground, obviously, as long as that doesn't affect other people and stuff like that. Perhaps, you know, whatever way I can do it that wouldn't affect other people, I can destroy my house because it's my house. But I can't go down to the local lake and destroy that by using it as a toxic dumping ground because it's not my lake. And then I'm interfering with our shared environment. So then that can count as an aggression against other people, you know? So that's the kind of, that's how I get out of it, if you like. That's, so I'm just going to get my laptop plugged in quickly because I'm running out of battery. Bear me one sec.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry, the plug had come out a little bit. I've plugged it back in. I'm good. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yes, sure. Do you mind running that last bit real quick? Because I just what I was going to say.
Yeah, you have to remind me what I said. The plug thing distracted me. I've lost my train of thought.
Yeah, sure. We'll probably get back into it. There was something else I
Oh,
wanted to mention.
I'm sorry, I remember it was the point about saying that, you know, you can only destroy that which you rightfully own.
Right, right. So essentially, do you think that that is a good measure for society? So it allows, uh, assuming for some reason there's this cartoonishly evil person that decides,
Yeah.
I'm going to really productively use my labor, craft this entire forest into beautiful chairs, and then burn them all. They could theoretically do that with this.
So
Uh,
is just to, so I can understand the example you're giving. Are you saying that they're getting like I'm saying they can't burn the forest to the ground, but you're saying they can get round that by turning the forest into wooden chairs and then burning those to the ground? Is that kind of
so Well, we can use a different example from burning because, like you said, burning, can cause fumes
well,
and
or
affect.
assuming that it's not causing outside harm, like so destroying it in another way? But is that the
Precisely.
point you're making? They're trying to sidestep my you can't destroy the forest by turning it into trees and then destroying and turning it into chairs and then destroying that. Is that kind of
Yeah, for example.
okay? Well, this is why I mentioned about the sustainable use, because it's not about the fact that you don't have the right to destroy your chairs, because you do. Chairs that you created yourself, again, they're your property, you have the right to destroy them. The point is you didn't have the right to destroy the forest. And whether you destroyed the forest just directly by just burning it to the ground, or whether you destroyed the forest by converting the entire forest into wooden chairs, either way, you've destroyed the forest. That's why I made the point of saying sustainable use. Everyone has the right to sustainable use. As soon as we start destroying our shared environment, then the claim of aggression can come into play. Because, and although there is still a continuum problem, which I can't deny exists, of, okay, well, where's the line? You know, like how much pollution is a violation and stuff like that. That's still a conversation which I do kind of have a sort of solution for in my Nations of Sanity project, which we can talk about. But one point that I like to make is even when you have this continuum problem, it doesn't destroy the distinction. You know, so we can say that pollution, like when someone says to me, is pollution a violation of the non-aggression principle? I say, well, it depends if it's harmful. And then I say, oh, well, how do you judge that? I say, okay, well, there's a continuum problem there, but that is the qualifier. The qualifier is if someone can make a claim of aggression. So if you're smoking a cigarette in your garden, I can't really make any claim that you're affecting me or harming me anyway. But if you build some industrial machine in your garden that starts using an exhaust vent in my garden and pumping toxic gas, then I obviously can make the claim that you're violating me and causing harmful pollution. Now, those are extreme examples at either end of it. And then obviously you bring that into some kind of rational kind of, well, what I would say is you bring it in as much as you can without losing objectivity completely. Losing sight. But the important thing is not to go the other way and say, because we've got this fuzzy edge, we lose the distinction. You know, because we've got this grey area, that doesn't mean we lose the black and white. It just means we need to find a way of separating the grey area from the black and white, which is something that we look to address in the projects.
Sure. That's actually, you mentioned something very interesting about the pollution and smoking. This is actually something that I would be curious to talk about, precisely the limitations of the NAP and what would be what would constitute as an aggression or a violation of the NAP, and so on. And that's a whole other rabbit hole. We could do that another time for sure, because I am very very much interested as well in the non-aggression principle and everything that constitutes. But going back into the example I gave, uh, where someone there's I don't think there's any ambiguity in this example where someone will take a few different uh, permissible behaviors under the self-ownership, ability to own the product of your labor, ideas, and as well what you may do with your property. So we'll take your right to be able to turn a tree into a chair using your labor, protecting the tree, creating something new out of it, and getting property rights from it. It's perfectly permissible. Then, once it is your property, you can destroy it. And this is something I have an issue with, but it's perfectly permissible along this train of thought. And you may do this with as many trees as it's you cannot do it with as many trees as you like.
No, because what you've got to understand is when you, because again, this comes back to the sustainable use thing, because you have a right to, so because the point is what I'm saying is if I say like this, you can't destroy this forest because you don't own this forest. I'm saying you can't get round that by converting this forest into a bunch of chairs and then destroying the chairs, even though you have a right to destroy your chairs, because you don't have a right to convert this forest into chairs, because that would involve destroying it. What I'm saying is you don't have the right to destroy this forest, because whether you just destroy it directly or whether you turn it into something new, that creation requires the destruction of the old. You know, to create something new, you have to destroy the old. So what I'm saying is you can't do it, but not for the reasons that you're like not for the reasons you might think. I'm saying you do have the right to destroy as much of your rightfully owned property as you wish, but you never had the right to turn that forest into your property in the first place, because that involved destroying it, and you never had a right to destroy that forest. You only had the right to use the resources in a sustainable manner. Does that kind of make a little bit more sense?
So yeah, it's kind of interesting because so that means that I guess there's a limitation to how much of a resource you can use.
Yeah,
Okay.
and to be honest, this is where it comes back to this limitation that the non-aggression principle sets. Because whether it comes to when we say you can do what you want with yourself, you know, you own yourself, you can do what you want with it as long as you don't violate others. We make the exact same comment about your property. You can do what you want with your property. You can make as much of it as you want, and you can do with it what you want. Again, as long as you're not harming others. And destroying our shared natural environment does cross over that line. So again, even though there is a continuum problem of, you know, how much pollution is harmful and how much destruction of our environment is, you know, like, you know, sustainable use is still going to have a hint of subjectivity to it. Like I say, we can minimize that the best we can, but the principle still stands firm over what you do have a right to do and what you don't have a right to do. You have the right to do whatever you want with yourself or your property, including creating new property, but you are always restricted by the fact that, like, so basically, if you can say to yourself, I'm definitely not affecting anyone else, I'm definitely not harming anyone else, I'm definitely not, then you know that you're definitely fine to carry on as you are. And if you know that you definitely are causing some kind of harm, then you know you've definitely stepped over that line. The fact there might be a grey area in between is something that needs to be dealt with as an overall issue, not just with this particular aspect. It's an overall thing that we, like I say, that we do deal with, and I'll get into that with you later when we talk about the projects and that. But that is something that's important to understand. You can still have the distinction even when you've got the continuum problem. You're just saying, okay, whatever we do, it's always restricted by the fact that we're not allowed to harm others. And although there might be a little bit of a fuzzy edge over when we cross that line, we've still got the precedent of that's what's setting the standard, if that makes sense.
So you could have, I think there would be a lot of issues. It would hard to make that into an objective standard, I think, because if you have an environmentalist group, they will have completely different ideas of how a forest should be treated, how much of the forest can be reused and remade into something else, into a chair or whatever. They will say you can't touch this forest at all. There's this and that animal's habitat, and you're disrupting it. It would be a little difficult
But
to
that's
get to a.
sorry, but that's more about burden of proof, though, because that's a little bit like saying, you know, like say that there was a big lake where we were all getting our drinking water from, and I said to you, look, you can't come and get your drinking water using that bucket because it's dirty and you're infecting the drinking water that we're all drinking. And that's kind of something that would fall into that grey area, because you say, no, it isn't, it's not harming, and I'll say, yes, it is. That's what I'm saying is that I'm not saying that's not a real problem. It is, but what it's an issue of evidence and interpretation rather than an issue of the principle itself failing. Like I say, the distinction still exists, but we just, unfortunately, we live in this reality where there are fuzzy edges and grey areas, and like a continuum problem where one turns into the other over a slow progression. I mean, pollution is obviously a good example of that, because if someone wanted to be really pedantic, they could say every time we breathe, we're polluting. You know what I mean? And certainly if you're smoking a cigarette or having a bonfire or something like that. But no one really could make a credible claim that that's harmful pollution. And if they wanted to try to make that claim, they would need to be able to prove it in an objective sense. So they'd need to be able to demonstrate it with evidence. If I wanted to prove that you're poisoning my drinking water because your bucket is that encrusted with all sorts of toxins or whatever, then I need to prove that. That I can't just make the claim. It can't just be, oh, well, I feel that this is how it should be. You know what I mean? It needs to be grounded in something more real. But so I accept what you're saying, because the issue you've raised is a problem. It is a flaw in. I mean, funnily enough, I was speaking to someone yesterday who was asking me to kind of give, okay, what's the flaw in the non-aggression principle? Because everything's got a flaw. What is it? And I said, and that's what I said was the flaw. The flaw is that no matter how objective it is as a principle, and no matter how clear and black and white it may seem to be, there's going to be fuzzy edges. There's going to be grey areas. And we do live in a world where people will want to stretch interpretations into absurdity. They'll want to exploit those grey areas. And that's why I have this specific solution in mind with this peace agreement that we have, to address that, because I do recognize that is an issue. But the issue is not a problem with the principle per se, but more a problem with the fact that people are going to interpret things differently. There are going to be disputes about reality and about facts, where I'm saying you're poisoning the water, you're saying you're not. Where we have that dispute, we need to be able to prove it. And it's, that's when it's going to come down to that kind of situation. And if I can prove that you're poisoning the water, then I can say, right, well, then you got to stop, because that's what you're doing. If I can't, then even though I might feel it or something, that's not enough, So, yeah, I hope that kind of made sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's even it's leaning more and more to my own opinion. I think we agree a lot on that. I think you're um, this last part you were talking about the proving the burden of proof, creating proof. This is where I think a lot of these gray areas are solved. I do think there are a lot of respectfully, I think there are quite a few gray areas there, and it's precisely the gray areas that make me wonder: does this hold water? Is this true? Can we really apply this? Um, and yeah, we'll still hopefully together we'll decrease these gray areas, or ultimately decide, well, actually, this or that idea uh, doesn't hold up to the scrutiny or this point. But if we can decrease those gray areas, maybe we can decide, yeah, we have this perfectly refined concept, and that we can then share or improve upon. Real quick, I was going to just say that my idea, and that you touched upon, that I completely agree with, is that if we use science to be able to determine how much percentage of this forest exactly can be cut in order to regenerate in a sustainable way? How much percentage of this forest exactly can be cut in order to maintain biodiversity and not disrupt the habitat of these creatures, and so on and so on. If we have uh, that factual evidence paired with the consensus, taking into account different opinions of people who are worried about the state of the trees or biodiversity or using the wood for whatever products they want. We take all that consideration into account, and then we apply it against the actual scientific data of what the forest can take and what it can handle, and that is how we solve this solution. To me, Of course, this idea of mind can have all sorts of problems as well. But I think this idea to me is the one that really reduces the gray areas, where it can have as much as a consensus as possible and solve this problem, hopefully.
Well, I agree. But the only thing I would point out about that is sitting underneath that idea as the morality of why we should even need bother would be that principle of non-aggression. Because, you know, like when we're saying, oh well, we need to decide scientifically what is sustainable and what wouldn't harm the thing and all that, but if someone's turned around and said, well, why should we give a crap what is sustainable and all that, that's when we can say because, and bring it back to the moral principle of, well, you don't have a right to destroy our shared environment because we, and you know what I mean. So it's like, so no, I agree totally with that idea, and that's very much in line with my own thinking. But like I say, the only thing I would point out is that even that idea, although you're saying, well, let's do it scientifically, even that, the underpinning of what you're trying to achieve is still kind of has that foundation that's built on this concept of the non-aggression principle, which, as I say, is itself built on the concept of self-ownership. But yeah, that's exactly how we'd have to do it. It's like I say, and it's almost the same as the example I gave with the, you know, I think you're poisoning my drinking water. I've got to prove that scientifically, and if I can, then that's, like say, you get it nice and objective. But the principle underneath it, well, why does it matter that you're poisoning my drinking water? Well, it matters because of the principle of the non-aggression principle. You're not allowed to poison my drinking water. Why does it matter that we're using these forests sustainably? Because no one's allowed to destroy them. Because the only thing you're allowed to destroy is your rightful own property. And even that, you can only do in a way that doesn't cause outside harm and effect. So yeah, no, I agree. I think that's probably to be honest, I don't think that's the only way we can do it. I don't see how anyone could sort of suggest another way, because it's like, you know, if we're not going to do it that way, how else are we going to do it? By the whim of ruling authorities? That hasn't gotten us very far so far. So, you know, I think that would be how we would have to do it.
Sure. And speaking of the concepts that are underneath, I think we can do a little bit of a tangent to precisely these concepts that lie beneath the structure of this society that you're trying to organize, right? The non-aggression principle, self-ownership, and why we should aim to have the most just society as possible, why that should be the goal. And to be honest, for me, completely in line with what we were just talking about. I fully understand that the um, purpose of Nations of Sanity starts off, it has a fundamental, which is how can we achieve the most just society for all, the most fair society? And um, I'd be more than happy for you to explain it yourself, not to explain it for you. Obviously, you know a lot more than me. You can go ahead and explain it better than I do. Me personally, I think it might not be necessarily the best starting point, because for creating a just society, you can still have people dying unnecessarily for all sorts of reasons. Me personally, I think precisely aligned with what we were just discussing, you can have if you have a scientific basis of uh, resource depletion, resource accountability, and consensus, where you take into account people's needs, paired with natural law. So, how much of this do we have? How much of it can we use for it to regenerate? What resources are more valuable than others? Can we replace this? What's good and bad for the environment? What should we pollute and not, and so on? Uh, that for me might be my preferred starting point. And instead of having a just society necessarily as the starting point, it would be how can we maximize uh, uh, the needs of people as much as possible, uh, with the backdrop of natural law and sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is as you're saying that though, I think to myself, but why can't you have the starting point of self-ownership underneath that? In fact, if you don't have the starting point of self-ownership underneath that, then where's the moral claim for why we should even bother with that method? You know, like saying this is the best way we can do this and that for people and create a better society. Well, the question is well, okay, if is morality even on the table though? Why do we want the best? You know, I mean, to play devil's advocate, it's like, well, why do we even want that kind of thing? And that's why I still feel that even that outlook still needs this principle underneath it, because that's giving us our moral basis. Because I mean, I totally get what you're saying with regards to, like, you know, like going beyond the nap. Like, is that really the best start off place? Because is that really enough? You know, because and I do agree with you that it's perfectly plausible. I wouldn't view it as super probable, but I would certainly say plausible that you could have a free society, as I've described, where the non-aggression principles of law and everyone's self-ownership is respected, but you've still got people starving, you've still got great wealth inequality, you've still got all sorts of things that would make it, you know, a hellish place to live. So I'm not pretending that my solution on its own creates any kind of utopia. In fact, one of the reasons why the project's called Nations of Sanity is because I like to emphasize that this isn't proposing utopia, it's proposing sanity. It's about creating a sane foundation for how we define crime, how we define rights, how we define morality in a way that's universal and objective. And then upon that foundation, that's what we build better. That's what we go beyond that. It's a little bit like, and I don't know if this, I've got obviously like our points that we want to cover written down, and I'm looking at two things that I could go to from here, and I'm not sure which way to go, because I could speak about positive obligation now, or I could speak about the specificities of that peace agreement I was talking about with, I'm going to touch on positive obligation for a minute, because it's a little bit like this, and this may connect to the positive obligation thing. The non-aggression principle, based on the concept of self-ownership. Say you've got an old lady who's struggling to cross the street. The non-aggression principle doesn't say that you have to help her across the street. It doesn't say that you shouldn't help her. It doesn't say you should or shouldn't. It just makes no comment on helping her at all. It just has no opinion in that regard. So, like I say, so to further your point, we could live in a society where everyone's 100% non-aggression principle compliant, but they'll just walk on by while some frail old lady struggles to cross the street and falls over or whatever, you know. And this is where it touches on the thing about positive obligation. The non-aggression principle doesn't create positive obligation. You don't have to help anyone. The only demand the non-aggression principle makes is that you don't harm anybody, that you don't violate their self-ownership. I'm not violating that old lady's self-ownership by not helping her, as much as it might be morally repugnant in another sense for me not to help her. I'm not actually violating her. The non-aggression principle says just that I don't mug her or, you know, or otherwise harm her. But my point is if we have a society where we understand that it would be a crime to harm that old lady, that we understand that she has this self-ownership that, you know, that we have to respect, if we have that bit as a foundation, then on top of that, what we want to build is a society that goes beyond simply not robbing and raping and murdering each other, but goes to a higher level where we're actually treating each other with kindness and actually helping each other. A society where we help the old lady across the street, because that's the society we want to build in. So it's like, I don't view the non-aggression principle as the beginning and the end. I just view it as I suppose where I'm coming from is I'm saying it is the vital first step. It has to be the beginning. It has to sit at the bottom of everything else we build, because everything else we build would be compromised without it sitting at the foundation. But it's not the end of the conversation. It's not the end of even the conversation about morality. You know, I talk about the non-aggression principle representing an objective standard of morality based on self-ownership, but then you've got our subjective morality and our personal ideals and things that offend us and affect us that have nothing to do with self-ownership. There's plenty of things that I disagree with that don't violate self-ownership, but I still have a moral opinion about them, you know, and helping old ladies across the street would be a good example of that. So that's the point I wanted to make with regards to that is making the non-aggression principle of the law isn't about creating the society we want on its own. It's about creating that foundation of what I would define as sanity, where we have a objective definition for defining crime. So we've got a universal standard for defining law, and then having that as a foundation, then we can go for beyond that, where we actually have a, because so I remember one time someone said to me when I described the non-aggression principle to them, they said, oh, that's a lot like the golden rule in religion. If you're familiar with the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do to yourself. And I said, well, it's similar-ish, but it's not quite the same, because the golden rule is more like what I'm talking about helping the old lady across the street. Because if you were the old lady, you'd want someone to help you across the street, and so that's going beyond the nap. The nap is almost like a kind of more basic. It's a similar kind of spirit of this, do unto others, but it's only demanding the minimum. It's only demanding that you don't. It's almost like if you think about an action of being neutral, positive or negative, the nap is only forbidding the negative. It has no effect on the neutral or the positive. It's just saying, don't violate people. So
yeah, there's actually the silver rule is exactly that. It's an inversion of the golden rule, so it becomes do not do unto others as you would have you would not have them do unto you. So it's exactly, don't do bad things to other people that you wouldn't like to have done to yourself. And I think that the non-aggression principle has a lot of similarities there.
yeah, I'd never heard of the silver rule, but yeah, that's more in line with with what I'm talking about. So yeah,
Exactly. It's just
so
as
to
you
use,
said, the difference between positive and negative obligations. Yeah.
yeah, so just to use that example, I suppose what I'm saying is look, let's get the silver rule installed, and then we can work for the golden rule. But there's no point going for the golden rule if we can't actually agree on the silver rule. I mean, if people can't agree not to mug old ladies, then there's no point trying to get them to help them across the street. If we can't agree to respect each other's self-ownership, then going beyond that and actually helping each other in a positive sense and actually having positive impacts, you know what I mean? It's kind of like you're trying to run before you can walk kind of thing. And that's why I view this as so vital as a foundation. But it is also important to understand that it's not the end of the conversation when we talk about morality and the society we want to live in.
Absolutely. And while we disagree very much on property and uh, ownership, there we disagree a lot. We completely agree in terms of morality in this case. I, of course, would rather call self-ownership, I forgot the word now.
Autonomy.
Autonomy, precisely. I'd rather call it autonomy. It excludes property. Makes me happier. Makes me. I don't know. It makes more sense. You don't have to impose any sort of ownership on it. But we absolutely agree on fundamentals of what is wrong, what should be considered to be wrong. Um, this positive and negative obligations, we completely agree with. There's only that example that we talked about. I think it was in our first conversation with someone drowning, where in that case I would say, well, negligence can also be considered immoral. But other than that, I think we completely agree on uh, the morality and the way you've explained it in the three conversations we've had now, and we've discussed it. I think is a fantastic way to describe it. We've gone over in detail precisely why is it that stealing is wrong, and even though we do disagree on linguistics and on the concept of self-ownership, I think you've done a great job at explaining the entirety of this idea, because there's several examples going through lots of different cases of immoral behavior and moral behavior and so on. And yeah, with this example of not necessarily having to do things that are good for others, like helping an old lady across the street, yeah, I agree with that as well. That's the final stage of a ideal society that we want to have, because we also don't want to somehow force people to do good things. We want them to get there by themselves, and we get them there by having their fundamental rights protected. And you've explained exactly that very well, I think. So on this topic, um, I'm 100% on board.
Okay, that's great. I mean, I, I don't know whether this is a good time to perhaps talk about the specific three-part peace agreement that I present and how I view it as addressing the continuum problem. Um, but I mean, I also would like to hear more about the area where we disagree on property ownership and stuff, because I'd like to hear more from you on that, because I'm not sure what specifically you know that you have issues on, but I'd be interested to know. So I don't know whether if that's something you wanted to go into first, or whether I should speak about the peace agreement first, or how you wanted to go about that.
I think you can talk about your peace agreement. I don't think we'll have time for both of those things because it'll delve into a lot longer discussion.
Sure,
So
yeah. Okay, well, just to introduce the peace agreement, because obviously you know the kind of low resolution version of the Nations of Sanity project is basically the assertion that the only way to create a free society with equal rights is to establish the non-aggression principle as the law through a peace agreement. Now, we specifically, and just to clarify for other people listening, the reason why it has to be done through a peace agreement is because ruling authorities violate the non-aggression principle. So you can't establish the non-aggression principle as law under the authority of some ruling government, because that would kind of contradict the principle, because obviously the principle would make ruling of governments basically illegal as ruling entities. Now, the reason why it's a three-part peace agreement is precisely the reason we touched upon, this continuum problem. It's not enough to just say, right, we're making the non-aggression principle the law and leaving it at that, because you have these grey areas, you have these fuzzy edges. Even if everyone has a good understanding of the non-aggression principle as a principle, that doesn't guarantee that we're all going to agree precisely where we draw every single line. Like, the examples we gave, like pollution, when does it become harmful, when does it step over that line of self-ownership? And there's loads of areas where this fuzzy edge thing can exist. Talking about age of consent would be another good example. We can appreciate the difference between a consenting adult and and a vulnerable child that can't consent, but when does one become the other? It's a blurry line, but that doesn't mean there's not a distinction. In fact, I have an article on my site called Where the Desert Meets the Grassland, which is an attempt to kind of explain this situation by saying, look, the analogy I use is I basically say, okay, you've got a desert and then you've got a grassland in two different geographical regions, and you can make that distinction. The desert is the desert and the grassland is the grassland. But in between, there's an area where one slowly becomes the other. Like if you're coming from the grassland and you're walking towards the desert, the land's going to slowly become more arid, and you're going to have this in-between stage where you're not quite in the grassland anymore and you're not in the desert and you don't really know where you are. You're in a kind of grey area. And my point is just because you have that grey area, it doesn't mean you lose the distinction. And I'm basically saying the same thing with the non-aggression principle. Just because you have the fuzzy edges, it doesn't mean you lose the distinction of the moral principle of what is a violation and what isn't. You've just got a fuzzy edge in between. So this peace agreement goes like this. You've got part one, which is just the basic agreement to make the non-aggression principle the law. Then part two is called lines in the sand. And this is where we draw the limits of tolerance over differing interpretations. And then part three is about ratifying rightful ownership according to the NAP. Now, part two is obviously the pertinent part of this to what we're talking about. And what this is about, when I say about drawing limits of tolerance, because there are these grey areas where reasonable people can disagree over precisely where we draw the line, we can say, okay, well, we have this grey area, but we also have the black and white. And what we need to do is we need to draw a line. Here, we can agree to disagree. Reasonable people could agree to disagree over whether this is acceptable. But once you cross this line, we are now saying, with obviously some level of consensus invoked, now you're definitely violating the non-aggression principle. So what we're kind of doing is we're basically saying, okay, we're taking the non-aggression principle and we're just lowering the resolution a little bit so that we can create it, so that we can make it universal, so that we can create this universal standard where we can say, okay, this might be a grey area, but this isn't. This is the line where no matter who you are, no matter where you are, you're violating the non-aggression principle, and then force is justified against you as a result. So, and then what you do with the grey area is, because obviously you've still got that grey area, but you create this universal standard in accordance with the non-aggression principle that's a low enough resolution to keep it as objective as we can possibly do, you know, within a reasonable framework of interpretation. And then what you do is you have voluntary collectives within that, societies, you know, regulated markets, whatever, any kind of voluntary collective where you have higher standards and additional rules that go beyond the non-aggression principle, or perhaps add that extra definition that you weren't getting from the universal standard. But those more higher ideals and those more specific rules only apply to people that are agreeing to be part of that collective. Whereas the universal standard that's set by this part 2, this lines in the sand, that's a standard that applies to everybody, regardless of whether they agree. So we're basically saying, look, you know, rapists and murderers and thieves, they don't need to sign our peace agreement. They're still not allowed to violate the non-aggression principle. And we have this universal standard of what the non-aggression principle is that we can enforce on everybody. But we have a higher standard as well, which we can't enforce on everybody. We can only have that as part of a voluntary agreement, or rules that people agree to as part of a voluntary collective that only applies to those people, which we can still, you know, encourage and discourage using non-violent method. But it's about separating, it's about drawing that line about when we can, because this is why I feel that it's so important to have the non-aggression principles law. It seems like a small thing in many ways, but it's a big thing in many ways, because it's about when we can use force. It's about defining crime in a universal way. Now you stepped over the line. Now force is justified against you because you're violating self-ownership, and then the force used against you is, you know, in response to that. So I hope that was relatively clear, and that makes sense. But that's my solution, for want of a better word, to that issue. Because it is an issue, the continuum problem. And that's, I think, the best way I can think of as to how we solve it, is we create a universal low resolution standard where we draw these lines in the sand so that people can't stretch these differing interpretations into absurdity, and we preserve the black and white, and then we just acknowledge the grey as something that we have to negotiate peacefully between people.
So if I understand correctly, first of all, thank you for that explanation.
Welcome.
Yeah, just to give you my immediate thoughts, first-hand thoughts on that. The line in the sand, it's an interesting problem-solving technique to deal with the gray areas. And so I probably don't fully understand it correctly, but where groups of people disagree, where there are gray areas, the line in the sand approach is them reaching a consensus of which side of an argument or an ideal can be made. For example, if we take our labor into a product example, since there's a gray area between how much of your labor constitutes producing something new, creating a new product, you could have a community of people decide, okay, you need to apply exactly this much amount of labor, or it must be clear that you've created a product in this particular way, and this way we won't have any confusion as to what is or isn't something that's been produced from your labor. Is that what you're saying? Do I understand correctly?
It is, but I probably wouldn't have invoked that example, just because I don't think there's much grey area that's open for play in that specific example, because I think we can stay relatively objective. But I mean, certainly something like the pollution thing, for example, would be a good example. Like, okay, this is like a universal standard where we all agree there's no open to interpretation, that this is the line where you're causing harm. And it's, like I say, it's something that would have to be based on evidence, obviously, but the principle is there, you're causing harm. But we might want higher standards than that. You know what I mean? It's one thing to say, okay, we don't want harmful pollution, but maybe we actually want a little bit more than just not harmful pollution. Perhaps we want higher standards. We want a nice environment that's more than just not harming us. That's where this kind of grey area. I mean, another example I often use, which makes people quite uncomfortable for obvious reasons, but is the age of consent issue, because that's another example where you've got a clear distinction between child and adult. You've got a clearly fuzzy edge, grey area in between over when exactly, and reasonable, and this is a perfect example, because reasonable people can have a debate over how old someone should have to be before we class them as, and it might not even just be about age, it's obviously going to be mental competency as well, but you probably combine the two, on something like that. Now, reasonable people can agree to disagree to an extent, but there's obviously going to be a line to be drawn there. And like I say, again, same with the desert and the grassland thing. Reasonable people can disagree in this arid little land where there's a little bit of grass there and a bit of sand there, and we can't quite distinguish what it is. Okay, we won't enforce it. Because we can't say for certain, we can't enforce it, because we can't, because the thing is if we can't say for certain that you're violating the non-aggression principle, but we use force against you as if you are, then we're guilty of violating the non-aggression principle, because we've initiated force against someone who themselves hasn't violated the non-aggression principle. So that's why the line has to be drawn on the you definitely are violating it, as opposed to putting it where you're definitely not. It's kind of a little bit like that innocent till proven guilty kind of approach to things. You know, like I can't say I'm only going to let you out because I know for certain you know that you're not harming anybody. It's like, no, I can't. I've got to leave you alone until I know for certain that you are harming anybody. Because if I do anything to you before that, then I'm the one who's guilty of committing a crime. So it's about, like I say, it's just about making it slightly lower resolution so that you can create this kind of universal standard without losing the objectivity of the principle, without, you don't want to go too far in either direction. And it will require a bit of discussion on certain issues, like age of consent. I'm sure that would invoke plenty of lively discussions, but the issue is there, because we have a similar thing right now where, like, I mean, I don't know how it is in all countries, but I know here in England, age of consent isn't exactly its own thing, because you've got age of consent is different for different things. Like for sex, it's 16 in England, but for drinking, it's 18. For driving, it's 17. I think voting is 21. I mean, we're all over the place, basically. And that's the one thing I think would be different. I think basically once you cross the line of being a consenting adult that has the ability to take control of themselves, then whether it's sex, drugs, legal contracts, whatever, you have that thingy. And if you're not at that stage, then whether it's sex, drugs, or legal contracts, you're not at that thingy. So, like I say, so you still got that distinction, but reasonable people can certainly have reasonable discussions within a certain range, but there's obviously absurdities where people can't step over. And I'm sure if somebody wanted to make the claim that a 30-year-old, just to use an example, who's of sound mental capabilities, doesn't have the right to call themselves an adult and should still be a child because maybe they're an overbearing parent that doesn't want to give them that liberty, they've stepped that, that's past that line in the sand. And conversely, in the other direction, if someone wanted to say, oh, well, this child can clearly consent to sex or something like that, again, we're saying, no, you're crossing that line, that child can't consent, and you're abusing them. So it's about saying that it's about saying that, because a lot of people that are like voluntarists and that invoke the non-aggression principle, they don't like talking about the fuzzy edges because it's the messy part that they haven't got an easy answer for. And there is no super easy answer for it, because it's just a reality of life. There are grey areas, but in my opinion, the only logical approach to those grey areas is to say, okay, well, let's draw a line where it's not a grey area anymore. And let's have our black and white preserved, so we can say, so we can at least preserve and we can at least create a universal international standard for defining crime, a consensus, as you say, but one that's truly as objective as we can possibly make it and as universal as it could humanly be. And then within that grey area, we've still got room to play around with, but that's where we have to invoke voluntary agreements, voluntary contracts, and we can only impose on those that are agreeing ahead of time to be part of it.
In a sense, is it like a proto-law where it's, or a quasi-law, where it's not something necessarily implemented, and it's not implemented by a government or an authority. It's reached as a consensus, as a standardized rule, where you're drawing a line and you're saying, This is the desert, this is the grassland. And if you don't agree, moved somewhere else where they have a different line in the sand, something along those lines.
Well, not quite, because when we're talking about the actual peace agreement, that's universal. So there's nowhere you can move to escape that. What we're saying is this black and white standard that we're establishing through this universal agreement. There's no country you can run to where you'll be allowed to rape, murder, and assault and all those things that are clear violations of the non-aggression principle. But what we're saying is in the grey area. And again, you don't necessarily have to move, but what we're saying is like, let's say, for example, something that's in the grey area, like age of consent, let's say, and just to simplify it, obviously age isn't the only factor, because obviously competency, and you can have people that are adults that aren't mentally competent, all that. But let's just forget that. Let's just do it on age, just for simplicity's sake. Say I was in England and the universal standard was like here and here, like, well, let's say it's 14 to 21 or something like that. So you can't go below that age, and you can't go above that as a universal standard. But in between that, that's the grey area that people have got room to play with. Now, let's say most of the people in my society decide, well, we're going to get together and we're going to have a voluntary collective that people agree to be part of. And within that voluntary collective, we're going to set an age of consent that everyone agrees to, that's more specific than this universal one. So we're going to say everyone that's part of our little collective society, whatever you want to call it, they agree to abide by an age of consent of 18. And then let's say I've got some sensibilities where I think, well, that offends me. I don't want to be a part of that. I think you're not a child, you're not, I think it should be 19 or 21. And I don't want to be part of this society where it's 17. What that means is they can't impose the age of consent standard of 17 on me, because that's their own little rule within the grey area, but they can impose the universal one. So does that make sense? So what I'm saying is there's a universal standard that applies to everybody, no matter who you are, no matter what you're a part of. And that's the non-aggression principle in this kind of low resolution, as objective as we can make it version. But then if we want a higher resolution society, we want higher standards than that, then we have to get people to agree to it. And like I say, but it doesn't have to necessarily be move. I don't have to move. I just say, oh, I don't want to be part of your society. But I don't have to leave the country or nothing, because there's no reason for that. I mean, I might want to if I want to go to a country where more people are in line with me, and then I can join their collective and I've got a society to be part of that's, in line with me or whatever. But my freedom as a self-owning individual will always be absolute. So even if I live in a country where 99.9% of the population has this voluntary collective that goes a certain way, I don't have to obey the rules of that voluntary collective. But I do have to obey the rules of this universal peace agreement, and that's why I call it, I mean, often when I talk about it making the non-aggression principle the law, I sometimes interchange that term with terms of peace. So sometimes I say law, sometimes I say terms of peace. I mean, I'm saying the same thing either way, but just to demonstrate how it would be implemented, rather than it being a law that's laid down by a ruling authority, it's the terms of peace that are agreed through a universal peace agreement, like a peace treaty. It's basically, we're declaring these are the terms of peace. We are defining our society as a society that, acknowledges, recognizes, and protects self-ownership as part of our universally agreed law. That's the one thing that I think needs to unite everybody. And then on top of that foundation, you can have societies that are very different. Like I say, there's still plenty of room to play around outside of of what the non-aggression principle demands, where societies can be massively different. I was talking to someone yesterday about how, because obviously anarcho-capitalists are well known as voluntarists, but I was saying, you don't have to be an anarcho-capitalist to be a voluntarist. You could be a voluntary socialist. You could be any kind of ideology, with the exception of fascism, can coexist with voluntarism. Because all voluntarism is kind of neutral. It doesn't specify any economic preference. It doesn't specify any kind of way of life. All it says is respect self-ownership. That's literally the only requirement. And on top of that, there's endless kinds of ways of life that we can explore and you know, they're not all going to be equally good and work out well. And like I say, that's why we still have to have the conversation on top of that, which is what you're alluding to, about creating a better society where we actually, you know, help each other, and it's actually better for people, because, you know, just having the non-aggression principle on its own isn't going to achieve that necessarily. But having that as the foundation underneath it allows us to step up for the better. I hope that all makes sense.
Yeah, sure. I think might have to give that a little bit of thought. Yeah, we might have to get into that a little bit more in depth at another time.
Yeah.
It is quite interesting, as you know, we haven't necessarily gone into depth uh, with the non-aggression principle, and this idea of a universal peace agreement is, to me, it seems like a kind of non-aggression principle where usually in the non-aggression principle, there's a lot of predetermined aspects that are fairly obvious. Don't steal, don't murder, and so on, as they are today. And once again, aggression principle reflection of the silver rule, which also existed for a long, long time. So they're very um, sensible depictions of what is moral and what isn't. And in this universal peace agreement, it's taking issues that may vary from age to age, as of course, with time, certain things that were moral are now immoral. And there are certain areas where people absolutely disagree in what is okay and what isn't. We could take a look at the example of pollution. I think that would be an interesting one to go into. And then usually our conversations are very conceptual. We do have more practical examples, but in this case, it would be interesting to discuss, how do we reach this line in the sand? We need to reach this absolute consensus that every society in the world needs to accept, right? And we can have a democratic process to get there, perhaps, but is it via voting? What happens in 10 years if people change their mind? And if we use the example of pollution gets worse. What if people don't follow it? Um, so I think it's something we might be able to get into more in detail next time. I appreciate you explaining it. I'll have to, well, get some ideas about what to discuss about it. Ask you how it'll be implemented in a more practical way, and give my critique, and try to scrutinize it as I usually do.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, I'd love that. I mean, as I say, I mean, I've enjoyed all our conversations and that, and I love getting into the conceptualization and the philosophy and the moral. And obviously, in our previous conversations, we've delved quite deeply into the real morality and having some real philosophical discussions. But moving into the practical applications of this, and obviously, how this works in the real world and implications and all of that, is obviously something I'm also very keen to speak about, because that, I mean, both parts of that conversation relate to the Nations of Sanity, because obviously the moral conversation underpins the Nations of Sanity project, but the practical application of that is obviously what the Nations of Sanity project is really about in regards to what we're proposing we actually do with this principle. It's like saying, oh, it's all very well saying, okay, we've identified this principle that could be universally applied and that is about as objective as it can get with morality and stuff like that. But then how do we use that in society? What's the implications? What should we do? And like I say, my stance with the Nations of Sanity project is to say, well, look, if we've got this principle that defines crime objectively, and provides us a kind of universal standard for what would be justifiably enforceable law, because it's providing that kind of, because I say law is a threat of force. It's law is like rules, but with the threat of force attached to it. It's more than just rules. Like, you know, I can have rules in my house. You've got to take your shoes off if you come inside, but that's not a law. There's no threat of force attached to that. I just rescind my invitation for you to come in my house if you refuse or something like that. But an actual law is basically saying, look, you're not allowed to do this. And if you do, you know, like, or else, you know, we'll use force to stop you. We're justified in using force to stop you. Once you've kind of got to that stage with regards to the philosophical discussion of what the non-aggression principle is, for me, it almost becomes self-evident to say, well, in that case, that needs to be the law. I mean, one of the things that never made sense to me growing up as a child is, you know, as you grow up and you learn about the world around you, when I first kind of discovered that there were different laws in different countries, like something that's a crime in this country is not a crime in that country, that made no sense to me, because I'm like, well, a crime is a crime. It doesn't matter where you are, and it shouldn't matter what your culture is. It shouldn't matter what point in time you're in, and all of these things, you know. And that's the point about having this objective standard for defining what a crime is. And I just say, well, once we've done that, it becomes self-evident that it should be law. And then once you have that decision, then the only way to apply it as law will be for a peace agreement, because, as I say, ruling authorities are violations of that principle. So, and then once I decided that it needs to be established for a peace agreement, I realized the fuzzy edges need to be dealt with somehow. If we really want a universally, something that can actually work in the real world, we can't just leave the gray area untouched, because it could infect the black and white, and people could push interpretations into absurdity if we don't draw a line in the sand. So again, that's how, so every part of this idea is like a, you know, like a logical progression of establishing something and saying, well, okay, if that's true, then that means this. And I feel like I've taken the implications where they need to go, but obviously I'm just one brain working that all out in my own head. So every time I get a chance to speak to somebody else who can critique it and push back and point to and highlight things that I might have missed, or shown, or even highlight things that I haven't missed but are able to address because it's someone else perceives it as a flaw or whatever, you know, it helps me kind of solidify and work this idea. I mean, even how much I've done it, when the Nations of Sanity was first conceived, it was only a one-part peace agreement. And then I realized I needed the multiple parts to deal with the gray area, after having conversations with people like yourself that started pointing out all of these gray areas that exist, and I couldn't deny that they did exist, you know. So it was like, oh shit, we need to do something about this, you know. So every part of this has gone through my own scrutiny, but like I say, I'm just one brain and not the most high functioning one, so I need as many other brains as I can to help me work through these ideas. So I very much welcome the scrutiny. I've enjoyed all the conversations we've had so far. And I very much look forward to having another one where we can delve into the practical applications of all of this.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have plenty of topics to discuss next time as well.
Okay, that would be great. Okay, so we'll wrap up this one then. And I'll just say, unless there's anything else you wanted to, before we do?
I don't think so, no. There's a few things we can get into next time. I do have my notes, and we can go in more in depth when we talk again.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay, right. Well, for everybody listening to this, thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do check out our previous 2 conversations, and there'll probably be a 4th by the looks of it coming up as well, hopefully in the near future. So thank you everyone for listening, and thank you, Thomas, for taking the time to have this conversation.